The phrase, student loans are good debt, sounds reassuring at first glance. Many people repeat the line without considering what it actually implies about money, time, and personal opportunity costs. By the end of this video, you will understand why that short slogan is sometimes dangerously incomplete, and occasionally true. Today, we have a national conversation that mixes hope, pressure, and financial reality in equal parts. The decision to borrow for school is one of the largest economic choices most young adults will face in their lives. Choosing education should be a strategic investment, not a tribal rite of passage, enforced by social expectations. There is a staggering amount of student debt in the United States right now, and numbers can shock people into paying attention. Americans collectively owe about $1.7 trillion in student loans, a figure that reshapes household balance sheets across the country. That sum sits alongside rising housing costs, uncertain job markets, and a generation carrying more financial risk than their parents did at the same age. But numbers alone do not tell the whole story about whether any individual loan is wise or reckless. Looking at national totals masks the difference between a strategic investment and an unsustainable burden placed on the wrong person at the wrong time. The essential question is not how big the debt is in total, but whether a particular loan improves lifetime earning potential enough to justify its cost. Where did the idea that student loans are good come from in the first place? Financial advisors often label borrowing for education as acceptable because it can produce higher lifetime earnings, similar to how mortgages are regarded as beneficial for building equity. That comparison sounds logical until you remember that a mortgage buys a durable asset, while education buys a bundle of future possibilities that do not guarantee returns. Good debt is a relative term that depends on two things: the expected return on the investment and the risk of that return failing to materialize. Treating every education loan as the same ignores differences in program quality, personal aptitudes, and labor market realities. To understand when student debt is actually good, we need to talk about expected returns, probabilities, and time horizons. Return on investment, or ROI, is the main metric for deciding whether student loans are sensible or dangerous. ROI in education means comparing the cost of tuition, fees, and living expenses against the additional money you expect to earn over a career because of that degree. Schools sell futures. Borrowers pay now for the possibility of higher wages later, and the math only works if those higher wages actually arrive consistently over time. But ROI calculations are full of nuances most people ignore when they are caught up in the excitement of acceptance letters and campus tours. You must consider not only average salaries, but median earnings, employment rates, regional job markets, and realistic career trajectories. A careful ROI analysis also factors in interest rates, loan terms, and the time value of money to avoid misleading conclusions about long-term benefits. There are degrees that, on average, return an easily measurable financial payoff within a few years of graduation. Engineering, computer science, nursing, and certain business specialties regularly produce above average starting salaries that help borrowers knock down loans quickly. When programs are accredited, aligned with in-demand skills, and connected to robust employer networks, borrowing can be a sensible short to medium-term strategy for faster career progression. It is important to understand that even within high ROI fields there are variations based on school reputation, internship, opportunities, and geographic location. A computer science graduate from a strong program in a tech hub will likely see a different trajectory than the same degree from a struggling regional college. This does not mean every student in high ROI majors will automatically prosper, but the probabilities usually favor borrowers when programs are well matched to job markets. Other degrees rarely generate enough income to justify large amounts of debt for most students, and those are the cases that explode the myth of universally good student loans. Majors in some arts, humanities, and social sciences often lead to important and fulfilling careers, but their median earnings fail to cover heavy borrowing in many cases. When tuition is high and expected earnings are low, the math that once justified borrowing collapses, and students find themselves repaying loans without commensurate financial benefits. Public policy and social expectations sometimes overlook these mismatches and encourage students toward expensive programs with poor financial outcomes. The prestige of a program, or the promise of personal growth, can mask the practical realities of labor market demand. Honest counseling, transparent outcome data, and realistic expectations are critical to prevent students from graduating into a financial trap. Doing the math on college costs versus earning potential can feel intimidating, but it is essential to making a wise decision. A careful calculation includes tuition, fees, living expenses, opportunity cost of not working, and realistic salary growth over decades. Ignoring any of these elements can turn a seemingly manageable loan into a decades-long burden and derail other financial goals like buying a home or saving for retirement. Simple back of the envelope. Comparisons can reveal surprising truths about certain majors and institutions, and they can shift the narrative from faith to evidence. When prospective students and families run numbers prospectively, they gain bargaining power and can compare cheaper alternatives that deliver similar career outcomes. Numbers are not destiny, but they are a necessary counterweight to emotional decisions made under pressure. Let me walk through a simple realistic example comparing two different majors and their long-term outcomes for salaried work. Imagine one student borrows heavily for a private liberal arts degree with median earnings below national averages, while another attends community college, then transfers into an affordable public program in a technical field. Over 20 years, the technical degree often produces a higher cumulative income despite lower initial prestige, changing the conversation about what counts as a worthwhile investment. These calculations depend on assumptions like career stability, geographic mobility, and continuing demand for particular skills, but they illuminate how borrowing decisions interact with choice of institution and major. The critical takeaway is that the pure label graduate does not guarantee upward mobility. The field of study and the cost structure matter immensely. When students run plausible scenarios, they often find less costly pathways to the same or better economic outcomes. Excessive borrowing is a predictable result when schools and lenders structure incentives poorly and students lack realistic counseling. Some students accept loans for lifestyle reasons rather than academic necessity, choosing expensive campuses and luxury living that inflate total borrowing. The phenomenon of borrowing more to maintain social status on campus demonstrates how cultural pressures can convert a potentially productive investment into a harmful liability. Financial education rarely matches the intensity of social messaging about college as a required pathway to success. So many young people arrive at enrollment decisions without a sober sense of cost and consequence. Universities benefit from tuition revenue and lenders profit from interest, creating subtle incentives that do not always align with student welfare. Breaking that cycle requires better information at the point of decision and structural changes that reduce the lure of unnecessary debt. There is also a powerful psychological trap that keeps the idea of education as an unquestionable good firmly in place. Parents, communities, and media celebrate degrees as moral victories and status symbols, which creates a blind spot around the practical economics of certain programs. When education becomes a social marker rather than a strategic investment, people make choices to conform instead of optimize. This cognitive bias is amplified by scarcity and fear. The fear of being left behind, the fear of disappointing family, and the fear of losing access to exclusive networks. These emotional drivers push students toward choices that may not align with their talents or the realities of the job market. Awareness of these psychological dynamics is the first step toward making more rational, personalized decisions about borrowing for school. Marketing and admissions offices do not always prioritize transparent conversations about post-graduation outcomes, and that creates information asymmetry for prospective students. Universities often celebrate placement rates and top salary numbers while burying median earnings and long-term employment statistics. Without standardized, easy to read outcome data, students and families cannot accurately compare programs or understand the real probability of financial success. Thankfully, there are emerging efforts to improve transparency and require schools to publish realistic employment and salary data. But implementation remains uneven, and the data can still be complex to interpret. Third, party resources and state-level scorecards sometimes offer better comparative tools, and students should make those resources part of their research process. Demand for clearer information is itself a form of consumer power that can shift incentives toward more fiscally responsible educational offerings. Alternatives to expensive four-year programs deserve equal attention because they often deliver strong career outcomes at a fraction of the cost. Community colleges, vocational training, and certificate programs can lead directly to well-paying jobs in fields like healthcare, technology, and skilled trades. For students who prefer hands-on learning or who need a cheaper route into the workforce, these alternatives can represent a smarter financial path without sacrificing dignity or long-term growth. The labor market increasingly values skills over pedigrees in certain sectors, and employers sometimes prioritize demonstrable competence and practical experience over institutional prestige. Apprenticeships and industry-backed certification programs create direct pipelines to employment that reduce the need for prolonged and expensive schooling. Recognizing these options expands the definition of success beyond the traditional four-year college model and allows students to match investment size with realistic returns. Community college often serves as an underappreciated bridge to both affordable credentials and transfers to four-year institutions. Many students begin at community colleges to save money on general education credits while living at home and working part-time, transferring to a respected public university after completing lower division requirements can cut decades of debt and still deliver the social and academic benefits associated with a traditional degree. Policy reforms that improve articulation agreements between community colleges and universities make this pathway even more viable. And some states now offer tuition-free community college options for qualifying students. These programs reduce upfront borrowing and allow students to test fields of study without committing to expensive four-year tuition from day one. For many students, the combination of low-cost beginnings and strategic transfer planning produces both academic satisfaction and better financial outcomes. Trade schools and apprenticeships provide another compelling alternative for learners who prefer practical skills and stable compensation early in their careers. Electricians, plumbers, HVAC technicians, and culinary professionals often enjoy strong demand, predictable wages, and the ability to earn while they learn through apprenticeships. In many cases, these pathways lead to entrepreneurship opportunities that do not require decades of unpaid academic internships or crushing debt loads. Societal bias toward white-collar degrees has historically devalued these careers, but labor shortages and demographic shifts are changing perceptions rapidly. Governments and private industry increasingly invest in vocational pathways precisely because they deliver reliable labor and reduce unemployment risks. When students consider these options with dignity and clear-eyed financial analysis, they often find superior cost-benefit ratios compared with certain expensive academic majors. Income-driven repayment plans and loan forgiveness programs change the calculus for many borrowers, and they deserve careful consideration as part of any plan. These programs can cap monthly payments at an affordable percentage of income and potentially cancel remaining balances after a period of qualifying payments. For people pursuing public service or lower-paying career paths, income-driven plans sometimes convert crushing debt into manageable obligations tied to earnings. However, these programs also carry complexity, eligibility rules, and political uncertainty that can make them unreliable as sole incentives to borrow heavily. Administrative errors, documentation requirements, and policy changes have disrupted many borrowers' plans in the past, creating anxiety and uneven outcomes. Using forgiveness programs as a backup plan, rather than as the primary justification for borrowing, offers a more prudent risk management approach for prospective students. Relying on future forgiveness as an assumption can be risky because policies change with political winds and administrative capacity. Some borrowers have seen relief programs paused, revised, or restricted, which leaves them exposed to long-term payments they did not anticipate. The moral hazard of borrowing under shaky forgiveness promises shifts risk from institutions to individuals, and that is a structural problem worth understanding before committing to high loan balances. More reliable financial decisions acknowledge programmatic uncertainty and avoid over-leveraging based on hoped for policy changes. Treat any forgiveness promise as a potential benefit rather than a guaranteed foundation of your financial plan. When you combine conservative borrowing with contingency planning, you reduce your vulnerability to shifting political landscapes and administrative hiccups. Real-life stories show how degrees that sounded impressive sometimes failed to translate into financial stability for graduates. Consider recent examples where graduates from expensive programs enter low-growth fields, struggle with underemployment, and carry loan payments longer than expected. These narratives humanize statistics and reveal how institutional promises and personal expectations can collide with harsh labor market realities. Conversely, many people have used modest borrowing strategically to unlock career paths that rewarded them substantially over time, which demonstrates the conditional nature of student debt. The right combination of program selection, geographic mobility, and skill development often separates those who flourish from those who flounder. These real stories teach us that context, not slogans, determines whether loans become tools or traps. There are also everyday success stories of people who refused the conventional 4-year path and still achieved financial stability through alternative routes. Tradespeople, technicians, and certificate holders often report lower debt burdens and faster paths to full-time employment with benefits. These examples demonstrate that financial security and social contribution are not limited to traditional degrees, and that diverse educational models can align better with certain personalities and markets. Highlighting these success stories is not an attempt to undermine the value of 4-year degrees, but rather to expand horizons and show realistic multiple pathways to prosperity. The modern economy needs a variety of skills, and recognizing that reality reduces unnecessary pressure to accumulate debt. For the sake of image, practical alternatives deserve equal respect in the conversation and economics. So how should prospective students decide whether to borrow and how much to borrow for education that promises future returns? Begin with a checklist of questions about expected earnings, employment rates, alternative pathways, and the total cost of attendance. Ask about scholarships, work, study opportunities, average debt at graduation, and the school's track record for placing graduates into relevant jobs. Use conservative estimates about starting salary and realistic timelines for career progress, instead of optimistic projections that assume constant rapid growth. Factor in living costs, regional job demand, and the possibility of career changes that might require additional training. The decision-making process should prioritize flexibility and the ability to adapt rather than locking into a single, costly path. Practical tactics exist to reduce borrowing and improve the odds that debt will pay off in the long run. Consider starting at a community college, applying aggressively for scholarships, negotiating financial aid offers, and working part-time to keep costs down. Choose programs with strong employer connections. Pursue internships that build marketable experience, and focus on skills that are portable across multiple industries. Another powerful tactic is to treat the first 2 years of post-secondary education as exploratory and low-cost. Then specialize later when you have clearer signals about your strengths and the labor market. This staged approach reduces downside risk and allows evidence from internships and early work experiences to inform final choices. Applying these methods increases the likelihood that borrowing will feel like an investment instead of a lifelong penalty. Beyond individual choices, the student loan landscape raises important questions about public policy, inequality, and the social contract around education. When access to quality education depends on debt, unequal starting points and family wealth begin to determine future mobility in ways that undermine meritocratic ideals. Systemic reforms like clearer outcome reporting, better funding for low-cost pathways, and targeted support for disadvantaged students could shift the balance toward more equitable and sustainable outcomes. The debate about student loans is really a debate about what societies want from higher education: a universal public good or a luxury commodity accessible mainly to those who can afford it. Our policy decisions shape incentives for institutions and students alike, and they determine whether debt functions primarily as an engine of opportunity or as a mechanism for extracting wealth from vulnerable populations. Understanding these stakes helps frame personal borrowing decisions as part of a larger civic choice. The truth, finally, is nuanced. Student loans can be either good or bad depending on the specific investment and the context in which it is made. A degree that produces clear, reliable income gains in an in-demand field can justify sensible borrowing and open doors that otherwise remain closed. Conversely, expensive programs that do not materially enhance earning potential or career stability are unlikely to be worth heavy debt burdens for most students. Learning to interrogate the numbers, challenge cultural assumptions, and explore affordable alternatives gives students agency over their futures. Treat loans as tools to be used judiciously, rather than slogans to be repeated unquestioningly. Ultimately, calling any loan universally good ignores the complex interplay of economics, psychology, and policy that governs outcomes. If you are watching this because you or someone you care about is about to make a borrowing decision, start by asking uncomfortable but necessary questions. What is the realistic salary for graduates in this program and region? And how many students actually land those jobs? What is the median debt at graduation and the school's timeline for graduates achieving debt-free status under typical circumstances? These practical questions cut through marketing spin and provide a clearer sense of financial risk. Bring these numbers into conversations with counselors, families, and financial planners, so you make choices grounded in evidence instead of hope. When you approach education as a calculated investment, you protect both your financial future and your capacity to pursue meaningful work. We often reduce this debate to personal responsibility, but structural solutions matter too, for those who cannot afford to gamble with long-term debt. Policies that expand grant aid, regulate predatory lending practices, fund vocational pathways, and increase transparency around outcomes make it easier for students to choose wisely. Collective action can change incentives so that institutions prioritize student success instead of revenue maximization. If you care about the future workforce and democratic opportunity, then the argument over whether loans are good must include policy discussions and private sector accountability. Broad reforms that lower costs and align credentialing with real labor market needs reduce the temptation to borrow excessively. This is not just a financial problem. It is a civic one that affects social mobility, economic growth, and community stability. To summarize, student loans are not inherently good or bad. They are conditional on the return on the educational investment and the risk tolerance of the borrower. Good student debt looks like affordable, targeted borrowing to obtain a credential with high employment prospects and clear paths to repay. Bad student debt looks like expensive, unfocused borrowing for programs with poor labor market outcomes, or for lifestyle consumption, unrelated to skill acquisition. Making wise decisions requires rigorous math, honest conversations, and exploration of alternatives that include community colleges, trades, and certifications. Policy and transparency improvements would make those choices easier for everyone, and individual prudence combined with structural change is the best path forward. Choose education deliberately, not reflexively, and you will avoid many of the traps that create lifelong financial stress. If this video changed how you think about borrowing for education, consider sharing it with someone facing the same decision right now. Conversations about college choices are too important to be guided by slogans and social pressure. So spread practical tools and data instead. Educated borrowing is not a moral failing, but a skill worth learning and teaching. The last thing to remember is that your education matters more than your debt alone, and your debt matters more than your degree alone. But they are parts of the same story. When you pair humility about uncertainty with disciplined planning, you convert a risky liability into a strategic investment. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe and stay curious about the decisions that shape your future.